be discussing such an important topic at a very timely moment when we're talking about AI through the lens of impact. So let me try and address your question in two parts. One on the data desert, and then what it means for how we democratize, or what it means for the kind of power dynamics and for smaller players. I think one of the big challenges in the Indian context is that a lot of the public data that we have, it sits in silos. We don't have the provenance of that data recorded. We don't have metadata for it. It's in different formats. It's in different languages. And there isn't really any mechanism yet to bring all of that together. I think we also need to remember that, data is not the same. Like, the data has to be collected for a particular purpose to be useful for that purpose. So if data has been collected, if we have a lot of data from around transaction data or social media data, that data in itself is not going to necessarily be helpful for building an application in healthcare, for an example, or building an application in agriculture. So when we're collecting data, or when the data that we have has not necessarily been collected or put together from the perspective of what we want to use it for. And that's a huge challenge also in terms of how that data has been recorded and so on and so forth. So that's one big piece of the problem. And the second, obviously, is that we have a lot of data that sits with private platforms, and they have collected it for a certain purpose with a certain kind of use case or a certain kind of end use in mind. And that reduces the usability of that data. But this is also proprietary data, and it's kind of locked away with private platforms, and so there isn't easy access to that data. So even though, when we think about India and we talk about India being a really data-rich country, when it actually comes down to a high-quality usable data, there really isn't very much. So recently, for an example, we have the new National Data Sets platform, something called AI Kosh. But when you actually look closer, you see that there's very few data sets on there, and the one that has been used the most is been downloaded like 400 times or something, which is nothing, right, for a country this size and the scale of the startup ecosystem. So there's a huge number of problems there, and definitely having ways to open up data if startups and other small entrepreneurs had access to high quality data, that could be a very important step in kind of shifting that balance and creating new opportunities for innovation. It would allow them to also build products that are culturally aligned, that are appropriate for the context, that speaks to the needs of the Indian population. But before I close, I just want to also caution, like, that alone in itself, of course, is not going to be enough, right? When we've seen time and time again that open systems are prone to capture, and actors with more resources, more compute capacity, more talent, and also just tech companies that have data sets across very different domains and are able to kind of collectivize that into a form of intelligence, are in a much, much better position. So, unless we think about the kind of political economy of that ecosystem while we're thinking about how to make data open, I think there is actually a risk that we undermine the very objectives that for which we're trying to make data more publicly available and accessible. So I think it's important that we do these things together, and we don't think about the kind of guardrails or the issues around kind of misuse and capture as an afterthought, or something that we do as a next step, because that, I think, will undermine what we're trying to do.
Thank you so much. You already made a point that I wanted to make as well here on the panel, namely that openness in itself is not an end. And we need to complement it with guardrails, with governance structures, and so on. So happy to dive into this also further along the panel. I would like to pass it on to Chennai. You do work on language data, and one of the topics that comes up again and again is benchmarking for African languages. If you look at evaluations, they are used to determine the impact and usefulness of AI systems, but for African languages specifically, those benchmarks basically don't exist. What is the practical impact on people in the global majority when AI systems can't be properly evaluated because benchmark data is missing?
Thanks so much, Leah. So when it comes to benchmark data, I think from what is accepted as a standard, if you're looking at Helm or MMLU, they are not reflective of the context and nuance of the African context. So on the African continent, there are over 2,000 plus languages, and these are the ones we've counted so far, which means there may be more. And then also the fact that in those languages, there's diversity and nuance by region, by context. So I speak Shona. The Shona that's spoken in Harare is not the same Shona that's spoken in Mutare, which is another town, because there's a sub-dialect. And also, African languages are quite emotive, so one word can have several meanings, and that is only captured by the way in which someone speaks that word. And I think most of us can relate to this. So that's often missing in the existing language benchmarks. There have been efforts on the continent, particularly looking at Sahara for African languages, and that's been started as a way to then benchmark some of the languages that are out there. And then for us as Masakane African Languages Hub, what we've actually done to respond to this is launch a request for proposals, which was this year in January, where we've been trying to find people to benchmark 40 languages. And they're looking at it from a speech perspective as well as a text perspective. And in this way, what we're trying to understand is which benchmark approaches work and which don't, and why don't they work? Because it's also trying to create evaluation solutions that understand context and nuance and also cultural issues involved. But as Vashi mentioned, the political economy around those data sets creation or the evaluating work. And so for us, it's also that whoever is going to be doing this work will actually make these benchmarks reusable so that we don't always have to reinvent the wheel. We build on top of what other people have already done. And then so in that way, we want the data set, the work to be openly resourced so that people can make use of it, and also open for improvement, because from doing the work on African languages and generally global majority languages, we have to think about it from a sustainability perspective. At the current moment, everyone is interested in having tools developed in global languages, because you can't just have, there are over 7,000 languages in the world, you can't just have a few of those represented. If you're going to have a product that actually works in market. And so then it's important that as we're thinking about this, it's actually led by the people from those regions, rather than it being a solution that's transported to that region, because then it'll always not work.
Thank you so much, Chennai. And building on top of what is already existing, that is exactly the essence of being open source and also of digital public goods. I think this part resonates quite well with us, and of course the sustainability question and community-led initiatives as well. Let's pass it on to Aya, and we are here at the AI Impact Summit. Current AI is an outcome of the AI Action Summit last year in Paris. And it was founded on the premise that the future of AI cannot be left alone to a handful of corporations, so it needs to be community-led. We need to have people on board to do this, to realize the benefits of AI for everyone. And so I would like to ask you, from your perspective, what are these specific structural problems that current AI is trying to address in the AI market, and how can openness and digital public goods be helpful in this regard?
Thank you for having me, Leah. So yes, Current AI was launched almost exactly 1 year ago at the French AI Summit, at the AI Action Summit in Paris. And this was an important feature because the summit didn't result in just kind of charters and conversations. An actual entity was formed. And the goal of Current AI is to champion and help build a vision for AI that is collective and that is collaborative and doesn't just represent one country or one company. And the reason that's important is multiple fold. So, you know, there's the obvious reason that we don't want all monetary gain to go to a handful of companies in the world. That's sort of like a really obvious thing. But also there are issues around what direction is the world taking. So I don't know if people have heard over the past few days, there's been kind of you could cherry pick a few scandals. So Ring, the company, the doorbell, the connected doorbell company, put out an ad in the Super Bowl where they basically showed that their product was a surveillance camera surveilling every neighborhood in America and basically recording you when you're on the street walking around. Not even a couple days later, we hear that Meta basically has decided that Meta glasses are going to start doing facial recognition on every person that the wearer will encounter. A few weeks before that, Amazon announced that Alexa is just going to start turning on for whoever has it. So they just, no decision you have to make. The device that you have is suddenly listening to you and sending data back. So the problem with these with market concentration is that you have these companies that just have large swaths of people that use their products, and they just get to decide to turn on a feature and change behavior and are really affecting societies at large. And so we want to create kind of a different vision for AI, one where people can create AI that works for them, that is in their language, that works for their community, that works for their needs. But in order to do that, and in order to withstand the amount of money and honestly the lead that some of these companies have, we look at the fact that we have to all collaborate to make that happen. That means countries have to collaborate among each other, governments have to collaborate among each other. That means communities around the world have to collaborate among each other. That means that we have to really come together as public sector, private sector, and philanthropic sector to be able to build this sort of like collective movement towards a better vision for AI. So, where does open source fits in? Obviously, open source as is sort of how we make the goods available and open and transparent and auditable. But for me, the more interesting part of open source is open source as an ideology and open source as a methodology for collaboration. Open source as a way for very large groups of people to collaborate together on a common goal and to be able to see their own contribution within that project, to be able to make progress on that contribution, to avoid duplication of work, and to be able to share learnings. That is the essence and the ideology of open source. That's, for me, what really inspires me. So, as an example, I just took the role of CEO at Current AI, not even, a little over a month ago. I come from Beirut, from Lebanon, a country that will never afford to have a data center. We don't have the physical space to be able to have data centers. We don't have electricity. The country constantly has power outages. We absolutely don't have enough water for people. How are we going to have water for data centers? And so what does AI mean for a country like Lebanon? Likely, there's a lot for our country to learn from countries, for example, like some of the ones that Chennai is working on in Africa, who also are resource constrained. So how do we enable this collaboration where we can think about what is common, what is different, what we can learn from each other so that the outcome can be better for all and our efforts can go farther.
Thank you so much, Aya. And I love your point about collaboration. Yes, please. So yeah, collaboration, that is really at the heart of the Digital Public Goods Alliance as well, because we are an alliance, we have more than 50 members. Mozilla is a member, the government of France is a member, and many others. So that really speaks to the heart of what we do and what we would like to see achieved by digital public goods. In addition, we also have the product owner community, for example, where product owners themselves also collaborate. And yeah, with this, I already mentioned the Mozilla Common Voice dataset is one of the DPGs that is on the DPG registry. It's there since 2022, so for quite a while already. And so I look at you, John, because Mozilla has been a champion of, for advocating for a healthy internet for many years now. And we now talked about AI development, but I also would like to quickly check in with you to see about AI deployment and challenges around how people can then actually make use cases with existing AI systems, existing AI models, and what is maybe needed there to close a gap. So.
It's the very last part of that.
No, I would like to ask you about the deployment challenges of AI that you see with, and that you address with Mozilla .ai?
Yeah, so at Mozilla AI, we are trying to do basically what Mozilla did for the open internet 20 years ago, now for AI. So one of the things that keeps me up at night is, well, what happens if we have this concentration of power? What happens if all of our data is flowing through just some small number of frontier labs? You know, do we have a world where the open internet as we know it now just disappears? And some of this is also touching on what Aya was mentioning, which is, you know, we like to build open source communities because these communities then allow us to create projects in grassroots ways from various communities. And then we, you know, at Mozilla can help support those projects either monetarily or by, you know, trying to bring the community together to push on new things. But at the end of the day, it's all about the community building and then owning what they built. And so that's maintaining open data, that's maintaining open source AI dev tools, that's maintaining open source AI models. You know, one of my theses for this year is that we're going to start seeing a lot more small language models mattering again, which means that we don't need, you know, orders of magnitude more capital than most people have anymore necessarily for some of these small models, and I think the community can come together and really build toward that. Now the question was about AI deployment, and deployment is tricky. You know, we have deployment using cloud-based services, most of which are black boxes run by, well, a lot of the CEOs who are at this summit right now, right? We have, I think, Sam Altman from OpenAI here. That is easy to deploy with an API call, right? I often give a talk where I basically make the case that open source AI needs to be easy to use if it's going to win. It's not just about model parity, it's ease of use. I have to be able to like default to using an open, potentially local model as opposed to going to chatgpt.com or to going to Perplexity or one of these. And I find myself doing this even, right? I'm an open source advocate, but I still go to these closed source model providers from time to time because they're so much easier to use in terms of like user experience than open source models. And so when it comes to deploying, you know, there's the cloud-based approaches, there's also local or on-prem, and those have their own engineering issues. You know, for those of us who have been engineers here in the room, we know how much of a pain that can be. That also means you need to have the know-how to stand up your own infrastructure, things like that. But again, the key point that I'd really like to hammer home here is like, if you're hearing people talk about deployment issues when it comes to AI, if you're hearing about people talking about not wanting to use closed AI solutions, then the thing that we should all be doing as an open source sort of friendly community, right, open source AI in general, is we should be working on sort of doing the boring things as well. Not just model parity, but also like making it dead simple to be able to deploy things in practice, to be able to use them, and so on. And so that's part of our mission at Mozilla.ai right now, is really trying to push for this to be the easy default to do the safe thing, which is using open source, which is when you can using local models, so you don't have Alexa turning on randomly, right? I can run my own local model on my own local hardware and I control it. That's my data, that's not anyone else's. We need to push for that to be easy to do.
Thank you so much, Don. And so we touched upon a few things: market concentration, the data desert, but also the difficulty of deploying models. And you mentioned a few good things here around that it needs to be easy, that everyone can use it, easily also localized, and fit for context, let's say. You also mentioned owning data, owning your own infrastructure. Could you just quickly walk us through about how this owning things connects to digital sovereignty and why this is so relevant for developers, but also for nations, for instance, at the moment?
Awesome. Yeah, so I'll get to the sovereignty pitch here. In fact, I don't think anyone has said that yet, which is surprising for a panel that is now about 20 minutes in. But when it comes to like a sovereign AI stack, when it comes to a sovereign open source AI stack, ideally you would want that to go all the way down to the hardware level, right? You would want to be able to compete against an ASML, a TSMC, a NVIDIA, right? You want to be able to like go all the way from hardware up into the application layer. Now, that's really, really hard to do, right? There is only one of ASML, there is only one of TSMC, frankly, and you know, every country's not going to be able to build that out. Every country shouldn't build that out. So we do need to make sure that our governments are collaborating, that our corporations are collaborating, because you know, I don't think any country can be truly sovereign in the sense from hardware all the way up to the app layer right now. Right? We have a globally integrated society right now, and these are very complicated companies. Now that said, I think once you start playing around at the software layer, sovereignty becomes more doable, I would say, for coalitions of countries, right? India certainly has the capital ability and the data ability and the skills to be able to compete at the frontier lab level. Something like the UK, though, isn't going to have the capital expenditure to be able to do that. And so, you know, I think the quote is something like the entire R&D budget for the UK is like half of what Amazon spends on R&D in a year, something like that, right? So the UK, a country like that, is going to have to partner with other countries if they want to be able to compete in that way.
I would maybe agree with everything that John said, but I would say also the other side of the spectrum of sovereignty is individual sovereignty. So at the individual level, what does it mean for you to have sovereign AI? I'm really interested in how we can enable people to have their own individual versions of AI, where the data stays with them, never goes on the internet, is not compromised, is not surveilling them. We just heard a few days ago, the US government is asking Reddit, Meta, Instagram, Discord to release data on their users and, you know, specifically who's criticizing ICE. So, like, you know, you're compromised when you're using some of these big tools and services. So how do we enable individuals to have their own devices? I spent 15 years of my life in the open source hardware space, and so that's a frontier that current AI is going into. And our contribution to this space is trying to be able to direct energy and resources towards you know, engineering and technical projects that are not financially viable, that a company is never going to take on because they'll never make the money back, or a country doesn't want to take on because there's not necessarily remuneration for their people, but that we believe need to exist in the stack. And so hardware, as John said, is a piece of it, and an individual version of that is something that becomes important.
Thank you so much for complementing this perspective. So digital sovereignty for room, actually. So when we speak about it, we often mean nations, but it can mean much more, actually, and it should mean much more. And this also provides an excellent bridge, actually, back to the data discussion and to how community get involved in collecting data and also what they grapple with. So Chennai, the work that Mazakane is supporting is community-driven. It's rooted in community engagement. And we discussed openness already as a way of collaborating, of mobilizing resources, of tapping into skills. And at the same time, we also already noted that openness in itself shouldn't be an end in itself. So looking at the work that you do and also the DPG standard, which requires open licensing, for instance, of the resources that are vetted as DPGs, what are your thoughts around how communities can actually solve this tension, I would say, between openness, cultural sovereignty or community sovereignty, if you want, and also compensation for creators?
Thanks, Leah. Yesterday we were on a panel and tension was used, and initially people were like, tension is bad. But one of the points that was mentioned by the speaker was how tension actually surfaces what needs to be done right. So if everyone is getting along, we're not going to put effort where there are gaps and where there's marginalization. So Mazakane actually means we build together in isiZulu. So that is the premise of how we approach openness. It's community-driven on the values of Ubuntu, which actually translates to my humanity is dependent on you, or I am because you are. And that's an African practice, African philosophy that a lot of people have been applying to the way in which they approach social issues. I'm a sociologist by training. And so then this is something that when we're thinking about openness and how community is involved, it's seeing the shared value of trying to build up on a resource that's missing because no one, you can't wait for someone to come and build it for you, or the fact that you see the value in just trying to have your language represented. So I think starting off with how community can be involved, the story of Mazakane is actually that it were people NLP researchers, machine learners who got together because they were being rejected from international conferences when they were applying for work and papers that tracked African languages. So they basically decided, you know what, we're going to come together and have our conversations. And this was 2019. And so 2019, one of the largest African languages space didn't have as much African representation. Now, because the Masakane community has come together, there are lots of papers co-written by people. So that's from a research perspective of actually then putting out the knowledge and challenging how people understand African languages. So that's the first part. And then the second part is also determining what issue do we want to address. So you can't take a top-down approach with community engagement. You can't say you have to build X because I think it's important, but you actually have to consult with community to understand what is a priority and what needs to be built. So the approach then in that work is actually what we have, an open platform. We actually even currently have an open survey right now where we ask people, what is it that you're curious about and what is it that you want to see being done by the Masakane community? And to also emphasize that the Masakane community is just not technical builders. It's sociologists, it's academics, it's policymakers, it's anyone who's curious. And it's not just Africans, it's open to everyone. So we have 3,000 people on our platform who are not just from the continent, but are also doing knowledge exchange, particularly championing South-to-South collaboration. So that approach of openness in terms of shared learning and shared knowledge is quite significant in how you get community involved in these processes. And then I think lastly, it's the collaborative approach. I think Masakane has contributed to Mozilla Common Voice in terms of the different entities there who are actually then creating the language data sets. And then the point around value contribution and paying people back, because that's often a big thing, is actually addressed by ensuring that end users are part of the creation process throughout. One of the things that we used to do when I used to work with Mozilla on the Common Voice East African Languages work was trying to figure out how do you honor people's time, which may not necessarily always mean paying them hard cash for contributing hours, which some people then do, but it has to have a data set standard, a set pricing standard, but it's also thinking what is the community in need of. So I often like to share this project where we needed to have representation of women in the data sets, which is often the most significant challenge, in that as much as you talk about community, there's often marginalized groups who are never part of the initiative unless someone is intentional about ensuring that they're there. So women are often left out. And so one of the things that we did was actually to work with the local social justice entity in Kenya that was supporting women with sanitary ware. And they simply said, we'll contribute to the platform if you supply or help us buy sanitary ware that we distribute, boxes that we distribute to the women in this area every month. Now, when we were telling our funder that, hey, we are running a sanitary ware project as part of our voice campaign, they were like, how does that connect, right? And we're like, it connects because at the end of the day, this is what matters to the people who we are claiming to build the technology for. But when you build with them, you are actually building on the lines of value that they have. And so that's how you actually capture community and understanding what is important to them right now, and then how do I meet them where they are.
Thank you. I love this example. No, it's such a fantastic point to really think about what the community needs and build on top of that, build with them, really. One aspect that I would also tackle here, Owashi, is how communities can work with tech companies, because that is what you are doing. And Chennai talked about the protection of women in data sets and bringing these perspectives in as well. And you do something similar in a way, I would say, with your work on gender bias in agricultural large language models. So from a DPG perspective, digital public goods, they need to adhere to privacy and laws. They should be designed to do no harm. They must be designed to do no harm. And safeguards need to be built in to mitigate them. How is the work that you do with communities, but also with the tech companies? How is this informing safety and transparency and trust of AI systems?
Thanks, Leah. I think civil society organizations play such an important role in kind of being that connective tissue between tech companies, global governance architectures, and the communities for whom we are eventually trying to create value for. And the reason for that, I think, is that civil society organizations have a really unique vantage point in understanding what is actually happening on the ground, in understanding what that impact of that technology is, and not just from a use case perspective, not just in terms of does this product do what it's supposed to do, but also situating that impact in the longer kind of arc of that community, the longer kind of arc of development initiatives in that space, and the longer and a larger kind of discussion around what the broader kind of structural impacts are. So I think civil society plays a really, really important role, and some of the work that we are doing is trying to strengthen what that kind of connective tissue looks like. And one piece that I think is really important, which is some work that we're going to be doing with Chennai as well, is to be doing contextual evaluations of AI. We don't think it's enough to be doing lab-based evaluations. We need to do evaluations of AI systems in real-world contexts, and really ask the question that, is this serving the purpose for which is this serving the end goal for the community, for the end user? So, if we're building a chatbot for a farmer, is that useful for that farmer? And what does usefulness look like for that farmer? So what we're trying to do is do these contextual evaluations, and through these contextual and build through these evaluations the benchmarks to be able to evaluate these models, and have the communities involved in building those benchmarks, have the communities involved in building those benchmark data sets. And I think part of that is, building these benchmarks for whether around questions around kind of usefulness or relevance and so on and so forth. And then, of course, also around issues like safety. And safety I don't think is something we can, again, understand in a lab context, right? Safety is something that is very contextual. There's a lot of work happening now in the safety ecosystem around, testing models against malicious attack or malicious use and so on and so forth. But in our work, we've really seen that the biggest risks actually come from deploying these systems in low resource contexts among vulnerable populations, where there isn't alternatives and where choice is not really meaningful, and you don't have the institutional guardrails in place. So the safety risks actually come from use, not necessarily from malicious attack, right? They come from the everyday kind of interaction. And so how do we embed that kind of understanding into the safety architecture that we're building? And I think, when we think about safety, you can think about safety from a kind of engineering lens, but then you can also think about safety in terms of functional safety, right? So if you think about a car, there is the engineering of that car, which maybe is the same model that is deployed everywhere. But the functional safety of that car has to do with, what are the existing rules in that particular context? So I think civil society organizations play a really important role in bringing that kind of contextual knowledge. And so to bring it back to the DPG conversation, I think that this kind of evaluation work can help establish some of the baselines before we actually release, before we actually scale, and can provide that feedback on how these DPGs are actually performing on the ground over a period of time, and where the work needs to be done, where that kind of maintenance work needs to be done, or the re-engineering of these DPGs needs to be done, so that they're still serving the communities in a way that is reliable and useful and safe for them.
Thank you so much. Yes, applause, please. So, yes, thank you. I think this was really helpful to understand how you work with the communities and with the tech scene as well. Looking at how to support these structures, how do we scale the work that you're doing, and how do we make sure that we collectively are able not only to develop this alternative vision for AI, but also to implement it, to deploy this kind of vision in a real world context? I would like to ask you, Aya, how is current AI supporting these things? How is current AI supporting public interest AI products, community-driven AI products, open source maybe, and digital public goods that really cater to this idea of an alternative scenario for AI?
So current AI is going to engage in 3 different modalities. The first pillar we call fund, and that's a grant-making function. We're going to give out grants to people who are already doing the work. So developers, nonprofits, small organizations, even for-profits that are doing work shipping technology that is open source and that is auditable, that attaches to the themes that we care about. The second pillar is called build. So we're going to build our own tech. We're going to have a small team that's going to co-create and co-build with some grantees and other partners so that we can invest outside resources in areas where, like I said before, there is no financial incentive for anyone to go, but we can, and B, to be able to stitch together efforts that exist outside in the world, like whether in the stack or in the community, and kind of like fill in gaps in between. And then the third pillar is called invest, and that's investment in architecture, in infrastructure. So investing in infrastructure for the movement. So this doesn't refer to infrastructure, technical infrastructure. Well, it is, some of it is technical, but it's really kind of community infrastructure more than anything, so that we can enable this kind of cross-pollination of work across countries. So the example that I gave before, between thinking about what AI looks like in Lebanon versus in a community in Africa, like that's where that would sit.
Thank you so much for sharing these insights. And I think current AI is such a great outcome of the Paris Action Summit, and I hope that the Impact Summit here will have similar great deliverables that we can work towards together. And my understanding is that they are working towards Impact Commons, which I think connects quite nicely to the DPG and openness discussion that we are having here on the panel. Being a bit mindful about time, I would like to make a little stop here and change gears. So I plan for a rapid fire session with you four here. So basically 1 question and short answers, 30 seconds if possible. And I will just ask you 1 question and basically connecting, and yeah, feel free to connect a few things you said in a very concise manner. So what is the 1 bold move or partnership we need to initiate this year that would most effectively scale digital public goods and public interest AI for the global majority? And I will leave it open who wants to go first.
Can I get 60 seconds instead of 30?
Sure.
So
I'll donate mine. This is collaboration. I'm going to donate my 30 seconds.
Good. This is collaboration. Look at that. 2 things. One is Mozilla likes to talk about forming a rebel alliance amongst nonprofits, governments, communities, for-profits to build out the open source AI world that we want to see. That's one. That's not the alliance that I'm going to submit here, though. I would love to see a new alliance, which is every frontier lab across the world, not just the US, not just China, the entire world, commits to, when they come out with like the nth generation of a closed model, they commit to open sourcing the previous generation. So the n-1st. So for example, if GPT whatever gets upgraded to GPT whatever +1, we see GPT whatever get open sourced. And we would work as a community as well to put in appropriate guardrails, to put an appropriate understanding of evaluation around that. But I think this is one way that we keep open source models, or at least open weight models, coming out, and that allows us to support sovereignty when it comes to open source AI, and that's at the community level, that's at the corporate level, that's at the individual level, to Aya's point, and that's at the national level as well. So I would love to see that second alliance of closed source frontier labs worldwide committing to open sourcing.
I have something. Can I take my 30 seconds
Sure.
back? Okay. I would like to call for people, individuals, not to fall into the trap of the iPhoneification of AI. So last year, OpenAI announced that they were acquiring Johnny Ive's company, who created the iPhone, because they wanted to create the iPhone for AI. And I think that we as a society are still kind of paying the price of that that opaque product that is finished and that we are all consuming and is consuming us. And so we get a chance and we get a vote not to participate in the iPhoneification of AI by just not purchasing it when it comes out. And so vote with your money and don't participate is my call.
Yeah, so 30 seconds, rapid fire. So for me, the biggest thing is, and this is our pillars of work at Masakane, is actually enabling a sustainable ecosystem with South-to-South collaboration. The honest truth is that we can't do this on our own, and it's important that we have sustainable, non-parachuting initiatives into these regions, and also thinking about how do we have ownership of the way in which we are creating our own technologies, and when we choose not to participate, what else can we participate in that still enables us to communicate and address the challenges that we have.
Just a +1 to what Chennai said, and also just to highlight that Chennai and I are both part of a Global South network for trustworthy AI that will be launched on Friday, and we'll invite all of you to join us for the launch and help us build this alliance together, because we cannot do it alone for sure. And I think just on the other side of it, while we invest in the open source AI ecosystem, I think we also have to ensure that we're doing enough to kind of dismantle the existing structures of power, because representation without shifting the balance of power can actually be more harmful and more exploitative. And so to that end, I think we really need to draw attention to the frontier labs and ask them to have transparency about what their business models are. We made the mistake with social media, let's not do it again. And we really need to address the vertical integration of the AI marketplace. Otherwise, again, all these good efforts risk being consumed by the existing dominant players.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing these points. And I, as a moderator, also have the pleasure of wrapping up here, and just maybe a few highlights from what I've heard here before we close it. First thing, community-led trust and infrastructure. So it's really about openness as an enabler of access, of safety and transparency and localization of AI systems, complemented by guardrails, by infrastructure, and by developments that are really rooted in communities. I think that was a very important point that we heard here. Secondly, to fundamentally shift power, we need to take people on board. So shifting power just with technology, with making things open, is not going to work. We really need to look at how communities are getting involved in these kind of developments, and bringing together different people to share learnings, to build on each other's work, but also maybe to start new alliances of even people that are not always working together, civil society, the big AI labs, for instance, but also policymakers, and really help to scale up these efforts that you are all doing here on stage, to move basically from technology access to technology agency and sovereignty for states, but also for people. And lastly, digital public goods, of course, can play a role in here. They provide an alternative pathway for these developments, whether it's through Mozilla's language data, with the Mozilla Common Voice dataset, or the packaging tools that John mentioned, or Masakane's and Digital Futures Lab on benchmarking. These initiatives are really demonstrating how we can collectively build to make an AI future that is not only serving a few, but the many. Thank you so much for this conversation, and